I still remember the way my tires crunched across that gravel driveway because for a second it sounded exactly like it had when I was 16, coming home after football practice, except this time there wasn't anybody waiting on the porch with a cold glass of sweet tea. There was a woman standing in the middle of the driveway like she owned every inch of it. And before I even had the chance to kill the engine, she pointed straight at my windshield and yelled, "Don't even think about getting out." My father had been gone less than 48 hours. I had driven almost 12 hours from western Oklahoma without stopping for more than gas and bad coffee. And somehow the first thing I heard after coming home wasn't, "I'm sorry for your loss." It was, "You don't belong here anymore." If you've ever wondered how fast a family can fall apart after someone dies, let me tell you. Sometimes it starts before the funeral flowers even arrive. My name is Ethan Walker, and for almost 20 years I lived nearly 700 miles away from the little Kentucky town where I grew up. People like to assume distance means you stopped caring, but life isn't that simple. I left because there wasn't much work left after the lumber mill shut down. Dad looked me in the eye the day I packed my truck and said, "Go build something, son. This town will still be here." I believed him. What I didn't know is that the town would still be here, but the people inside it would slowly rewrite the story of who I was. By the time I pulled into Dad's driveway that morning, everyone thought I was the son who disappeared. Nobody knew about the phone calls every Sunday night. Nobody knew about the envelopes that never had return addresses. Nobody knew about the transfers that quietly left my checking account every month for nearly 2 decades. The only thing they knew was that they hadn't seen me around much. And in a small town, what people don't see usually becomes the truth they decide to believe. Standing in front of me was my sister-in-law, Melissa. She was dressed like she was hosting a neighborhood brunch instead of helping prepare a funeral. Perfect hair, expensive sunglasses pushed up on her head, phone already in one hand like she had been waiting for this moment. Behind her, my older half-brother Kevin stood near the porch without saying a word. He wouldn't even look me in the eyes. That hurt more than Melissa screaming at me. She folded her arms and laughed without smiling. Well, look who finally remembered this address. I took a slow breath because I could already feel every neighbor watching through their curtains. "I'm here to see Dad." The words came out quieter than I expected. She shook her head. "You're too late for that." I nodded because I knew she was right. Nobody needs to remind a son that he arrived too late to hear his father's voice one last time. "I came for the funeral." She stepped closer. "No, you came because you heard there was a house involved." Across the street, old Mr. I. Hanley had stopped watering his lawn. Mrs. Brooks had opened her front door just enough to watch without looking like she was watching. That's how small towns work. Nobody wants front row seats. They just somehow end up with them. I looked over at Kevin. "You really gonna let her talk for you?" He rubbed the back of his neck but never answered. Melissa did. "Kevin doesn't have to say anything. We both know you haven't been part of this family for years. Funny thing about grief. Sometimes it doesn't make you angry right away. Sometimes it just makes you tired." I wasn't standing there thinking about the house. I wasn't thinking about furniture or money or inheritance. All I could think about was the old fishing pole Dad kept hanging in the garage and whether it was still there. I wanted one more chance to sit on the back porch where we'd watched thunderstorms roll across the hills every summer. That's all. Melissa pulled out her phone. "If you take one more step, I'm calling the sheriff." I actually smiled a little. Not because anything was funny, but because I'd driven all night imagining 100 different ways this visit could go, and somehow this one never crossed my mind. "Melissa," I said calmly, "I'm not here to fight anybody." "Good," she snapped. "Then leave." There was a long silence that felt heavier than any argument. Finally, I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a worn brown envelope that had been sitting beside me the entire drive. I didn't open it. I just held it against my side. Melissa noticed immediately. "What's that?" I shrugged. "Something Dad wanted me to have." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might stick. "Please, don't tell me you think some old letter changes anything." I looked past her toward the front porch where Dad used to sit every evening with his coffee. The rocking chair was still there, empty now, slowly moving in the breeze like someone had just stood up. For one brief second, I almost turned around and left because walking away would have been easier than fighting people I once called family. Then I remembered something Dad told me years earlier while we were replacing shingles after a storm. He said, "The truth doesn't get louder just because people are yelling over it." So instead of arguing, I sat down on the bottom porch step with that envelope resting across my knees. The neighbors kept watching. Melissa kept talking. Kevin kept avoiding my eyes. and I quietly realized that every single person standing there believed they already knew how this story was going to end. None of them had the slightest idea that my father had spent the last 3 years making sure it would end very differently. Nobody moved. Melissa kept tapping her foot like she was waiting for me to finally lose my temper. Kevin looked like he wanted to disappear into the porch behind him, and the neighbors had completely given up pretending they weren't watching. I ran my thumb along the edge of that old brown envelope for a second before I looked up and said, "Dad told me there'd probably come a day when I need to open this in front of everyone. I just didn't think it'd be the morning before his funeral." Melissa laughed, not a nervous laugh, not even an uncomfortable one, the kind of laugh people have when they're convinced they've already won. "This ought to be good," she said, folding her arms even tighter. "What is it? Some old birthday card?" I carefully pulled out the first document. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't sentimental. It was a certified court document with raised seals pressed into the paper. I didn't wave it around dramatically. I simply held it where Kevin could see it first. "Dad updated everything 3 years ago." Kevin frowned. "Updated what?" "His estate." Melissa immediately stepped between us. "Don't bother. My attorney already said everything goes through probate." I nodded. "It already did." That wiped the smile off her face. For the first time all morning she stopped talking. I handed the document to Kevin. His eyes moved slower with every line he read. "No," he whispered. "That can't be right." "It is," I answered quietly. "The probate process was prepared before Dad passed. Everything was filed exactly the way he wanted." Melissa snatched the papers from Kevin's hands so hard one page nearly blew across the yard. She scanned them once, then again, then a third time. I could actually see the confidence draining out of her face. "You're lying. It's difficult to fake a county seal. This has to be temporary." "It isn't." She looked toward Kevin. "Say something." He looked back at me instead. Why would Dad do this?" That question hurt more than anything Melissa had said because Kevin honestly didn't know. He had lived in that house the entire time, but somehow he'd missed everything that mattered. I took another sheet out of the envelope. Maybe because he knew the whole story. Melissa tried grabbing those pages too, but I pulled them back. "These aren't for ripping." Then I laid them across the hood of my truck, one stack at a time. Bank statements. Hundreds of them. Every transfer highlighted in yellow. Every month. Every year. Utility payment. Prescription reimbursement. Roof repair. Furnace replacement. Hospital deductible. Property tax. Insurance premium. One after another. Month after month. Year after year. Melissa stared at them before looking back at me. "What is all this?" "The reason Dad never lost this house." Kevin slowly picked up one statement, then another, then another. The dates stretched back almost 18 years. You paid all this?" I shrugged. "Not all of it. Dad paid what he could. I covered what he couldn't." Kevin's mouth opened but no words came out. Melissa recovered first. "That doesn't mean anything. Families help each other." "You're right," I said. "They do." She pointed at the house. "We've been helping too." I looked at her for a long second before answering. "Have you?" The silence that followed said more than either of us could. Mr. Hanley quietly crossed the street. He didn't interrupt. He simply looked down at the paperwork resting on my truck. After a minute, he removed his cap. "I remember when your daddy had that heart surgery," he said softly. "Folks wondered where he got the money." I smiled just a little. "Now you know." "Mrs. Pimpton thing." Brooks slowly walked over too. "The roof? After that tornado." I nodded. 2019. She looked at Melissa. "I thought your insurance paid for it." Melissa's face turned bright red. "That's none of your business, Mrs." Brooks answered without raising her voice. "Apparently it wasn't yours either." Kevin sat down hard on the porch steps, rubbing both hands over his face. "Dad never told me." "He didn't want you embarrassed," I said. "He told me he hoped you'd figure it out on your own." Kevin looked up, eyes watering. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I honestly didn't have a complicated answer. Because Dad asked me not to. He said helping someone stops being help the minute you start keeping score. I still remember the phone call 3 winters earlier when he sounded weaker than I'd ever heard him. He didn't ask for money. He asked about the weather in Oklahoma. We talked about fishing, college football, his tomato plants. Right before hanging up, he casually mentioned the furnace had quit working. I ordered a new one before we ended the conversation. He argued with me for 10 minutes afterward because he didn't want me spending the money. That was Dad. Proud to a fault. Generous even when he had almost nothing. Melissa suddenly slammed both hands onto the hood of my truck. You think writing checks makes you a better son? I looked her straight in the eyes. No, loving him did. She stepped back like I'd shoved her, even though I never moved. There are moments when anger burns so hot it actually cools into something else. That's where I was. I wasn't trying to humiliate anybody anymore. I was just tired of watching my father's life get rewritten by people who had only seen the last chapter. Kevin stood up and walked toward me slowly. Did Dad really leave you the house? I nodded once. Everything. Everything? The house, the land, his truck, the workshop, his savings. Every legal document is in that envelope. Kevin swallowed hard. Then, where does that leave us? Before I answered, another pickup rolled into the driveway. A silver Ford with a magnetic sign on the door that read Carter and Blake Legal Services. Melissa smiled again, almost instantly. Finally, she looked at me with renewed confidence. Our attorney's here. An older man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He shook my hand first. Melissa's smile disappeared again. Mr. Carter, she said quickly, tell him those papers don't mean he can just throw us out. The attorney looked at me, then at the documents spread across the truck, then at Kevin and Melissa. He adjusted his glasses before speaking in the calmest voice imaginable. Actually, Mr. Stoney, Walker contacted our office 3 years ago with your father's authorization. I helped prepare these filings. You could have heard a pin drop across the neighborhood. Melissa blinked twice. Excuse me, your father was very clear about his wishes. No, you represent us. Mr. Shell. Carter shook his head gently. No, ma'am. I represented your father. Melissa looked like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She reached for Kevin's arm, but he slowly stepped away instead. For the first time since I'd arrived, my brother finally looked directly at me. Not with anger anymore, not even with resentment, just confusion, regret, and the painful realization that the man he'd lived with for years had carried an entire secret life of quiet sacrifices without ever asking for recognition. And standing there with every eye in the neighborhood fixed on us, I realized the paperwork wasn't the real surprise that morning. The real surprise was that my father had somehow managed to leave behind one final lesson, one none of us were ready to hear until it was far too late. Mr. Carter waited until the silence settled before he spoke again. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't need to be. Everything your father wanted has already been reviewed and approved, he said, closing his briefcase. There isn't another hearing coming. There isn't another decision waiting to be made. Legally speaking, the property belongs to Ethan. Melissa stared at him as if saying the same sentence enough times would somehow change it. There has to be something we can do. Mr. Carter gave her the kind of look only an attorney who's delivered difficult news 1,000 times can give. Sometimes the hardest answer is also the simplest one. Kevin leaned against the porch rail, completely defeated. I hadn't seen my older brother cry since we buried our mother when I was 14. But there he was, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand while staring at the front yard Dad had spent 35 years mowing every Saturday morning. He knew this was coming, Kevin whispered. Didn't he? I nodded. I think he knew all of us better than we knew ourselves. There wasn't any satisfaction in saying it. I'd imagined this drive home 100 different ways over the years, but never once had I imagined standing there watching my own family unravel. Melissa finally looked at me instead of the paperwork. For the first time all day, the anger was gone. Fear had taken its place. You're really going to make us leave? She asked quietly. I looked at the front porch, the old rocking chair, the flower bed Dad refused to let anyone else touch because he claimed tomatoes grew better if you talked to them every morning. Every corner of that property carried a memory. None of those memories involved revenge. Dad never raised me that way. I took a slow breath before answering. The court says I could ask you to leave today. Melissa lowered her eyes. Are you going to? I shook my head. No. Both she and Kevin looked up at the same time. You'll have 60 days. Melissa looked genuinely confused. Why? I smiled, tired more than anything, because that's exactly what Dad would have done. Nobody said another word for several seconds. Even the neighbors quietly drifted back toward their homes. Not because the story had become boring, but because it was suddenly personal. This wasn't about a house anymore. It was about the difference between owning something and earning it. Over the next several weeks, I moved into the little room at the back of the house where I'd slept as a kid. Every morning, I'd make coffee before sunrise, then walk out to the garage that had become more of a storage unit than a workshop. Dad's old tools were still hanging where he'd left them. His workbench still had pencil marks from projects we'd started years ago. I cleaned everything one shelf at a time. I repaired loose cabinet doors, sharpened rusted blades, and swept away years of dust until the place finally looked like it belonged to him again. In the afternoons, I'd work in the backyard garden. The soil had gone hard from neglect. Weeds had climbed over the tomatoes, and the fence leaned just enough to remind me that time never stops, even when people wish it would. A few neighbors started stopping by. Mr. Hanley brought over a box of old photographs he'd found in his attic. Mrs. Brooks showed me a handwritten recipe Dad had given her wife years before. Little by little, I realized something unexpected. My father hadn't just quietly helped people. He'd quietly become the kind of man everyone depended on without even realizing it. Kevin came by almost every evening after work. At first, we'd barely speak. We pull weeds, replace broken fence boards, organize the garage, and let the silence do most of the talking. One evening, he finally looked at me and said, "I spent years thinking you left us behind." I kept working for another minute before answering. "I never left Dad." He nodded slowly. "I know that now. I just wish I'd known it while he was still here." There wasn't anything I could say to fix that. Some regrets don't need advice. They just need to be carried. Melissa apologized before moving out. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no grand speeches. Just a quiet conversation on the front porch where she admitted she'd mistaken proximity for love and assumed living under the same roof meant she'd understood the man better than anyone else. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she wanted to. Either way, I accepted the apology because holding on to anger would have been the one thing my father never would have forgiven me for. These days, I still live in that house. The rocking chair sits on the same porch. The garden grows a little better every season. And every Sunday morning, I catch myself making 2 cups of coffee before remembering why there's only one person drinking it now. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Dad had never organized those papers, if he'd trusted us to work it out ourselves. Maybe everything would have ended the same way. Maybe it would have ended much worse. That's the part I still think about. So let me ask you this. If you were in my place, would you have given Kevin and Melissa 60 days? Or would you have followed the court order and asked them to leave immediately? Do you think blood should matter more than loyalty? Or does real family come down to the people who quietly show up when nobody's watching? I'd really like to hear where you stand. So leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think about someone who's been quietly caring more than anyone realizes, share this video with them. Subscribe for more real stories about family, justice, and the moments that change us forever.